It was a crisp autumn evening in the upscale neighborhood of Oak Ridge. The streets, lined with towering oaks and pristine townhouses, exuded wealth and exclusivity. The streetlights cast elongated shadows, flickering intermittently as the wind rustled through the leaves. At this hour, the roads were mostly empty, save for the occasional luxury vehicle cruising toward the gated driveways of their mansions. Officer Brian Carter tapped his fingers against the steering wheel of his police cruiser. His patience wearing thin. It had been a long shift. And nothing exciting had happened, just the usual noise complaints, a minor traffic violation, and a couple of false alarms. He hated working this district, where crime was rare, and his presence felt more like a formality than a necessity. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something, or rather, someone, a black man in a tailored navy blue suit stepping out of a sleek black Mercedes-Benz. The man walked with a quiet confidence, his gait steady, his head held high. He reached into his pocket, presumably for his keys, as he approached the front door of a house too grand for someone like him, at least. That was what Brian immediately thought. His grip tightened around the wheel as suspicion coiled in his chest. He had been patrolling this area for years, and he rarely saw black residents, certainly none who carried themselves with such authority. His instincts screamed at him. Something wasn't right. Without hesitation, Brian switched on his flashing lights and pulled up behind the Mercedes. Stepping out of his car with calculated authority, his boots hit the pavement with purpose as he adjusted his belt, ensuring his gun was positioned prominently. "Sir," he called out, his voice sharp. "Hold it right there." The man turned slowly, his expression calm but slightly puzzled. He raised his hands slightly, a universal gesture of compliance. "Is there a problem, officer?" His voice was deep, measured, carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. Brian scanned him, his gaze lingering on the expensive watch glinting under the porch light. His uniformed mind worked quickly, piecing together an assumption: a black man, expensive car, designer suit, high-end neighborhood. Either he was a criminal, or he was up to something illegal. "I need to see some identification," Brian demanded. The man's brows furrowed slightly. "For what reason? I live here." Brian scoffed. He had heard this line before. Suspects trying to outtalk the law, using words and confidence to mask deception. "And I'm supposed to take your word for it?" He took a step closer, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his holstered firearm. "ID. Now." The man exhaled slowly, clearly restraining himself. "I don't see why that's necessary." Brian's patience snapped. "You don't get to decide what's necessary. Either you hand over your ID, or I'll have to assume you're trespassing." A moment passed, charged with unspoken tension. Then, the man sighed and reached into his suit jacket, moving deliberately to avoid any sudden gestures. He pulled out a sleek leather wallet and handed Brian his driver's license. Brian snatched it without a second glance, his eyes scanning the details. Michael Dawson. The name didn't ring a bell. His address matched the house. But that didn't mean anything. A fake ID was easy enough to obtain. "Step away from the door," Brian ordered. Dawson's jaw tightened. "This is absurd." "Sir, I'm not going to ask you again." Before Dawson could protest further, Brian grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. Dawson let out a grunt of pain, his body tensing against the aggressive restraint. "Get on the ground," Brian barked, shoving him toward the pavement. "What the hell are you doing?" Dawson growled, struggling against the unwarranted aggression. Brian forced him down, pressing his knee against Dawson's back. "Stop resisting." "I'm not resisting." Dawson's voice was strained with anger and pain. But Brian didn't let up. He was too deep into the moment, too convinced that he was in control. He barely noticed the second patrol car pulling up, nor the hesitant figure of Officer David Martinez stepping out. "Brian," Martinez called uncertainly, taking in the scene. "What's going on?" Brian ignored him. "Stay where you are," he ordered Dawson, as if the man had any choice. Dawson exhaled sharply, his breath uneven against the cold pavement. He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself, then spoke with quiet authority. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" The station was unnaturally silent. The usual hum of radios, the murmur of officers exchanging stories, and the clatter of paperwork were absent, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. Brian sat at his desk, sipping his now cold coffee, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He had processed Dawson like any other suspect: fingerprints, mugshot, and an official charge for resisting arrest. He felt a flicker of satisfaction. Another arrogant civilian put in his place. Then, Captain Reynolds stormed into the room. "Brian, my office. Now." Something in the captain's voice sent a chill down Brian's spine. He exchanged a glance with Martinez, who looked paler than usual. Brian rolled his eyes and followed Reynolds into the office. The door slammed shut. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Reynolds' voice was a dangerous growl. Brian frowned. "Sir, Shut up," Reynolds snapped, throwing a folder onto his desk. "You just assaulted and unlawfully detained Michael Dawson, the goddamn Secretary of the Interior." Brian's stomach dropped. He felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath him. "What?" His voice was barely a whisper. "You heard me." Reynolds leaned forward, his face inches away. "You put a federal government official in handcuffs. You threw a goddamn cabinet member on the pavement. And you did it because he's black." "That's not true," Brian protested weakly, though his mind was spinning. "Oh, really?" Reynolds pulled up a security feed from the station. Pressing play, the footage showed Dawson, still in his suit, staring at the camera with an icy calm. "You have no idea what you've just done," Dawson had told him. Brian felt his chest constrict. "They're calling for your head, Carter," Reynolds continued. "The media got wind of it. The mayor's been on the phone for the last hour. The governor is involved. And if you think this is going to disappear, you're dead wrong." Brian swallowed hard. "So what happens now?" Reynolds exhaled sharply. "You're suspended, indefinitely. And if I were you, I'd get a damn good lawyer. Because this is just the beginning." The media had latched onto the story like a pack of starving wolves. News networks ran the footage on a loop. Michael Dawson, shoved to the ground, his face pressed against the pavement, while a white police officer pinned him down. Headlines screamed, "Racial profiling at its worst. Cabinet member assaulted by police. When will it stop? Another black man brutalized by law enforcement." Social media exploded. Protests erupted outside the police department. Calls for Brian's arrest flooded the city. Even the White House issued a statement condemning the act. Brian sat in his darkened living room, beer in hand, watching his world burn on the screen. His phone buzzed. Another unknown number. Another death threat. His career was over. His life as he knew it was over. And for the first time, he felt something he had never felt before. Fear. Brian Carter had always believed himself to be untouchable. He had worn his badge with pride, certain that his authority would never be questioned. But now, sitting alone in his darkened apartment, the glow of the television illuminating the room with endless headlines condemning him, he realized how quickly the world could turn against him. His phone buzzed again. Another notification. Another message filled with threats. "Hope you rot in hell. Pig. You messed with the wrong man. We're coming for you. Justice will be served." Brian clenched his jaw and threw his phone onto the coffee table, watching as it skidded across the surface and nearly fell to the floor. The knot in his stomach tightened. He had been receiving threats all day. Some from anonymous numbers, others from people he had once called friends who now wanted nothing to do with him. Outside, the city was in chaos. Protesters had gathered outside the police station, holding up signs with slogans like, "End police brutality," and "Justice for Michael Dawson." The anger in their voices was palpable, their chants echoing through the streets. The sight of them on the television only made Brian's skin crawl. He wasn't used to being the villain. A knock at his door made him freeze. For a moment, panic gripped him. Was someone here to hurt him? Was this the moment one of those threats became real? Slowly, he stood and made his way to the door. Peering through the peephole, relief flooded through him when he saw David Martinez standing on the other side. His expression grim. Brian unlocked the door and pulled it open. "What the hell do you want?" he muttered. Martinez hesitated before stepping inside. He glanced around the apartment, noting the empty beer bottles and the crumpled fast food wrappers strewn across the table. Brian had never been the cleanest guy, but this level of messiness was uncharacteristic. "You look like shit," Martinez said finally. Brian let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah? No kidding." Martinez sighed and ran a hand through his short black hair. "Brian, this is bad. Real bad." Brian scoffed. "You think I don't know that?" The whole damn country wants my head on a platter. They're not just coming after you. Man, Martinez said, they're coming after the whole department. Internal Affairs is breathing down our necks. The FBI is involved. And, he hesitated. The mayor just announced a full investigation into racial bias in law enforcement. They're using you as the poster boy for everything wrong with the system. Brian's hands balled into fists. That's bullshit. I was doing my job. Martinez looked at him carefully. Were you? Brian's eyes narrowed. Don't start with that. You were there. Martinez. You saw how he was acting, like he was above the law. He was above the law. Martinez shot back. Because he's literally the damn Secretary of the Interior. You tackled a federal official to the ground because you assumed he didn't belong in that neighborhood. Do you know how bad that looks? Brian's face burned with anger. He was being difficult. Martinez exhaled sharply. Or maybe he was just tired of being harassed for no reason. Maybe he was tired of guys like you thinking he's a criminal just because of his skin color. Brian's lips curled in disgust. Oh, so now you're turning on me too? Martinez shook his head. I'm not turning on you. Brian, I'm trying to help you see the reality of what's happening. You're drowning, and if you don't start swimming in the right direction, you're going to sink for good. Brian turned away, staring out the window. The distant glow of the protests flickered like an angry fire in the night. They've already decided I'm guilty. He muttered. What the hell am I supposed to do now? Martinez hesitated. You need a lawyer. A damn good one. Brian let out a hollow laugh. You think some lawyer's gonna fix this? It's a start, Martinez said, but you also need to get ahead of this. The media is painting you as a monster. And if you don't speak up, that's the only version of the story people will hear. Brian turned back, his eyes dark. So what? I go on TV and cry about how I'm not a racist. Beg for forgiveness from people who already hate me? Martinez sighed. I don't know, Brian, but sitting here, drinking yourself into oblivion, isn't going to change a damn thing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything settled heavily in the room, the anger, the regret, the uncertainty of what came next. Finally, Martinez took a step toward the door. Look, man, I don't agree with what you did, but I also don't want to see you throw your life away over it. Think about what you want to do next, before someone else makes that choice for you. And with that, he walked out, leaving Brian alone in the suffocating silence of his own downfall. Meanwhile, in a sleek, glass-walled office downtown, Michael Dawson sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled in front of him. His phone had been ringing nonstop, but for the moment, he ignored it, lost in thought. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind. One moment, he had been returning home from a long day of meetings, the next, he was face down on the pavement, handcuffed like a common criminal. And all because a white cop had decided that a black man in a nice neighborhood didn't belong. He had dealt with racism before. He had grown up in a world where people like him were always expected to prove themselves twice as hard. But this was something different. This was a moment that the world wouldn't forget. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, he called. The door opened, and Aisha Thompson, his chief of staff, stepped inside. Her dark eyes were sharp with determination. Her stance firm. The White House just called, she said. They want you to make a statement. Michael exhaled. He had expected this. And what do they want me to say? They want you to calm things down, Aisha said. Tell the public to trust the system. Let the investigation play out. Michael let out a bitter chuckle. The same system that threw me to the ground? Aisha crossed her arms. They're scared, Michael. They know this is bigger than one bad cop. They know this is about the entire structure of law enforcement. Michael nodded slowly. And what do you think I should do? Aisha held his gaze. I think you should tell the truth. Loudly, clearly, without sugarcoating it. Michael leaned back in his chair, staring out at the city skyline. He could hear the protests from here. Faint but unwavering. People demanding change. People demanding justice. He had a choice to make. And this time, he wasn't going to stay silent. Michael Dawson stood before the mirror in his office, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored navy blue suit. His reflection stared back at him, calm, composed, yet burning with a quiet fury. He had spent years in government, navigating political minefields, negotiating with world leaders, shaping policies that were supposed to bring change. Yet, in a matter of seconds, he had been reduced to just another black man in America, thrown to the pavement by a cop who saw only the color of his skin. The air in the room was thick with tension as he turned toward his chief of staff, Aisha Thompson, who stood near the television, watching the news cycle spin out of control. The footage of his arrest played on repeat. Anchors dissecting every second of the video. Analysts debating the state of policing in America. Protest leaders calling for systemic reform. The president wants you to keep it measured, Aisha said, scrolling through her phone. They don't want you to escalate the situation. Michael let out a humorless chuckle. Measured. That's a nice way of saying, don't rock the boat. You know how this works. Michael, she said, they want you to be the respectable black man. The one who forgives. The one who preaches unity. Michael turned away from the mirror, rubbing his temples. I played that role long enough. Aisha hesitated before speaking again. Then what do you want to say? Michael walked toward the window, looking down at the sea of protesters gathered outside his office building. Their signs were a mix of pain and defiance. Justice for Dawson. End police brutality. How many more? The chants echoed through the city streets. A chorus of frustration that had been brewing for generations. I want to tell the truth, Michael said finally. I want people to know that this wasn't just about me. It's about every black man who's been stopped for looking out of place. It's about every person who's had to lower their voice, keep their hands visible, make themselves smaller just to survive an encounter with the police. Aisha nodded slowly. Then say it. Say all of it. Michael turned back to face her, a determined fire in his eyes. Call the press. I'm making a statement. 15 minutes later, the cameras were rolling, microphones set up, journalists crammed into the conference room of the Department of the Interior. The room buzzed with anticipation as Michael Dawson stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He took a deep breath before speaking. Yesterday, I was reminded of a painful truth, one that every black person in America knows all too well. He began, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what title you hold. It doesn't matter how much money you make or what neighborhood you live in. To some people, you will always be a suspect first. The room was silent, every reporter hanging onto his words. I was thrown to the ground, humiliated, treated like a criminal for simply existing in a space that Officer Carter believed I didn't belong in. But let me be clear, this is not just about me. This is about a system that allows officers like him to act on their biases without consequence. This is about the thousands of black men and women who have suffered worse. Who never got the chance to prove their innocence. Who never got to walk away from that encounter. Michael's voice grew stronger, more resolute. I am demanding a full, independent investigation, not just into my case, but into the patterns of racial profiling and abuse of power within law enforcement. This is not about revenge. This is about justice, and I will not rest until it is served. The room erupted into a flurry of questions. Camera flashes going off like fireworks. The world was watching, and Michael Dawson had just declared war on a broken system. Brian Carter sat in his lawyer's office, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Across from him, his attorney, Jack Whitmore, reviewed a stack of documents, occasionally glancing up at Brian with a mix of frustration and disbelief. This is bad, Whitmore finally said, setting the papers down. Really bad. Brian scoffed. No shit. You don't seem to get it. Brian, Whitmore continued, you're not just facing departmental charges. You're looking at possible federal civil rights violations. Assault, unlawful detention, abuse of power. If the DOJ decides to push this, you could be facing actual prison time. Brian's stomach turned. Prison. The word hit him like a punch to the gut. Cops didn't do well in prison, especially cops with a reputation like his. I was just doing my job. Brian muttered. He was being uncooperative. Whitmore leaned forward, his expression sharp. Your job? Your job was to protect and serve, not to slam a goddamn cabinet member to the ground because you didn't like the way he looked at you. Brian's fists tightened, but he said nothing. You have two choices right now. Whitmore continued. You can dig your heels in. Double down. Try to fight this, and let me tell you, you will lose. Or you can get ahead of this. Publicly apologize. Take responsibility. And try to negotiate a plea deal before this goes to court. Brian felt his pulse hammering in his skull. You want me to grovel? I want you to survive. Whitmore shot back. Brian swallowed hard. He had spent his whole life believing he was in control, that his badge gave him power. But now, stripped of his authority. The walls were closing in. And for the first time in his life, Brian Carter was truly afraid. The country was split. On one side, people rallied behind Michael Dawson, seeing his experience as yet another example of systemic racism. Protests spread from city to city, voices demanding police reform, demanding justice. On the other side, right-wing pundits and conservative media rushed to defend Brian Carter. They painted him as a victim, a man whose career had been destroyed by woke mobs and political correctness. Tensions ran high. In the streets, violence erupted between protesters and counter-protesters. Police forces struggled to contain the chaos. The country was once again at a breaking point, with one question hanging in the air. Would this be the moment that finally forced real change? Or would history repeat itself? Michael Dawson sat in a high-rise conference room, surrounded by civil rights leaders, government officials, and community activists. "This is our moment," one of them said. "The world is watching. We need real policy changes, not just symbolic gestures." Michael nodded. "We need accountability. We need legislation that holds officers accountable for racial profiling and excessive force." Another leader spoke. "We also need to ensure that this movement doesn't just fade away like so many before it. We need lasting reform." Michael exhaled, looking out the window at the thousands of protesters below. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about changing a nation. And he wasn't going to stop until it happened. The courthouse was a fortress of cold stone and steel, its tall columns casting long shadows against the pavement as the sun set on another chaotic day. The air outside buzzed with tension, a volatile mixture of anger, hope, and uncertainty as a crowd of protesters and reporters swarmed the steps. Signs bobbed in the sea of people, their bold letters declaring demands for justice, while the rhythmic chants of the crowd created an almost hypnotic hum that reverberated through the streets. Inside the Grand Hall, beneath the towering ceilings and dim chandeliers, Michael Dawson sat with his hands folded before him, his fingers tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm against the polished mahogany of the table. He was calm, composed, at least on the outside. Inside, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. His attorneys whispered amongst themselves, their voices hushed but urgent. Across the room, Brian Carter sat beside his own legal team, his jaw locked tight, his posture rigid. He looked different from the last time Michael had seen him. His once confident arrogance was replaced with something else. Something closer to fear. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose as one. As soon as everyone was seated, the trial began. Brian's lawyer, Jack Whitmore, was the first to speak. He approached the jury with practiced ease, his voice calm and deliberate. "My client, Officer Brian Carter, has dedicated his life to the safety of this city. He has made mistakes, as we all have, but he is not the villain the media has painted him to be. He was doing his job, protecting a community he has sworn to serve." Michael resisted the urge to scoff. This wasn't about one officer. This was about a pattern, a system that enabled men like Carter to act without consequence. Then it was the prosecution's turn. Brian Carter didn't act in the interest of justice. The lead attorney began. He acted on his biases. He saw a black man in a wealthy neighborhood and assumed the worst. He didn't ask questions. He didn't listen. He didn't treat Mr. Dawson like a citizen deserving of respect. He treated him like a criminal simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. That is why we are here today. As the trial proceeded, the evidence was laid bare. The footage of Brian slamming Michael to the ground played on the courtroom screen. The gasps of the jury audible. Witnesses testified. Neighbors who had watched in horror. Officers from the precinct who spoke of Brian's history of aggression toward black men. Even former colleagues who admitted, under oath, that Brian had been protected by the system for years. Michael sat through it all, his face unreadable. He didn't want to just win this case. He wanted it to mean something. By the time the closing arguments were made, the world was watching, and soon, the verdict would come. The city was at a standstill. Schools closed early. Businesses shut their doors. Crowds filled the streets, glued to their phones, televisions, and radios, waiting for the decision that would determine whether justice had finally been served. Inside the courthouse, the air was thick with anticipation. Michael Dawson sat with his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable as the judge addressed the jury. Has the jury reached a verdict? A middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a steady voice stood. "We have, Your Honor." The silence that followed was deafening. "In the matter of the People versus Brian Carter, we find the defendant." The pause stretched for what felt like an eternity. "Guilty on all charges." The room erupted. Gasps, cheers, cries of relief. Michael felt a rush of breath leave his body, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as he processed the weight of those words. "Guilty." Across the room, Brian Carter slumped back in his chair, his face pale. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Brian didn't seem to hear it. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order. "Sentencing will be scheduled for a later date. Court is adjourned." Michael rose to his feet, turning toward the reporters, the activists, the faces that had fought alongside him. Justice had been served, but was it enough? Despite the guilty verdict, the streets remained restless. The protesters outside the courthouse erupted in celebration, but their voices were laced with something deeper than relief, frustration, exhaustion, the bitter understanding that one conviction would not undo decades of injustice. Michael Dawson stood at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out at the crowd. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. He had won, yes, but what came next? Aisha Thompson approached him, her phone pressed to her ear. "The president's office wants a meeting. They want to talk reform." Michael nodded, already knowing that the fight was far from over. "Then let's talk." Later that night, as he sat in his office, scrolling through messages of support, he saw something that made his stomach drop. A news alert. Right-wing groups vow retaliation for Officer Carter's conviction. Protests planned in multiple cities. Tensions escalate. The battle was far from over. Brian Carter had been transferred to a high-security holding facility as he awaited sentencing. But he was far from safe. The moment he entered the prison system, he became a target. He was a former cop, one who had brutalized black men. And now, he was surrounded by those very men, many of whom had suffered at the hands of officers just like him. His first week inside was a nightmare. He was isolated, watched constantly by both the guards and the prisoners who wanted him dead. He was no longer Officer Carter, he was just another inmate. Stripped of his authority, his power, and his protection. One evening, as he sat alone in the cafeteria, a figure slid into the seat across from him. A tall black man with sharp eyes and a quiet, calculating presence. "You don't remember me, do you?" the man said. Brian tensed. The man smirked. "You arrested me 5 years ago. Threw me against a car. Broke 2 of my ribs." Said I, looked suspicious. Brian's heart pounded. "Funny, huh?" the man continued. "How the tables turn." Brian swallowed hard. "Look, the man raised a hand. "Save it. I don't need an apology." "You know why?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because you're gonna rot in here. Just like the rest of us." Then he stood and walked away, leaving Brian alone with the realization that this was his new reality. Powerless, alone, and entirely at the mercy of the system he had once upheld. Michael Dawson watched the headlines continue to unfold. He had won the battle. But could he win the war? Would the system change? Or would history repeat itself, as it always had? Only time would tell. Michael Dawson had spent his entire career fighting battles within the system. But this victory felt different. It wasn't just about him, it was about a movement. About people demanding change. About holding law enforcement accountable in a way that had rarely been done before. But as he sat in his office, staring at the never-ending stream of emails, calls, and news updates, he felt an unsettling thought creep into his mind. Was this truly a victory? Brian Carter had been convicted. Justice, in its most immediate form, had been served, but nothing about the system had fundamentally changed. The protests had not stopped. The debates on television had not quieted. The far-right backlash was growing louder. And in some parts of the country, police brutality had only increased, almost as if some officers wanted to prove they could still act with impunity. Aisha Thompson entered his office, placing a stack of documents on his desk. "You need to see this." Michael rubbed his temples before flipping through the pages. Reports from civil rights groups, newly compiled statistics, and a series of leaked memos from police unions discussing officer morale post-verdict. One line stood out to him. If officers feel restricted in their ability to do their jobs, they may become less willing to engage in proactive policing. Michael scoffed. So now they're saying that holding a cop accountable is making them afraid to do their jobs? Aisha folded her arms. That's the argument they're pushing. Cops are scared, so crime will rise. It's the same playbook they always use when they're backed into a corner. Michael shook his head. If they think they can scare the public into letting this slide, they're dead wrong. Aisha's expression darkened. Then we need to move fast. The White House is offering you a seat at the table for police reform talks. They want you involved in drafting legislation. Michael leaned back in his chair. This was what he had wanted, real, systemic change, the opportunity to shape policy, to ensure that what happened to him wouldn't happen to others. But he also knew the truth. Change in Washington was slow, painfully slow, and those who benefited from the status quo would fight him every step of the way. We'll do it, he said finally. But we don't just go in there asking for favors. We go in with demands. Aisha nodded. Then let's get to work. The halls of Congress were filled with voices, lobbyists whispering deals, politicians calculating their next move, and activists trying to make themselves heard. Michael Dawson had been here before. But this time, he wasn't just another government official. He was a symbol. As he walked through the Capitol, he could feel the eyes on him. Some were filled with respect, admiration. Others were cold, resentful. Inside the committee room, a panel of lawmakers sat waiting. At the center of it all was Senator James Callahan, an old-school politician with deep ties to law enforcement unions. He had made it clear that he wasn't a fan of the proposed reforms. Mr. Dawson, Callahan said, barely concealing his disdain, while we all recognize that your personal experience was unfortunate, we must also consider the impact that excessive restrictions on our police force may have on public safety. The American people want to feel protected. Michael met his gaze evenly. The American people also want to feel safe from the very people sworn to protect them. Callahan smirked. Are you suggesting that our police are the real threat? Michael didn't flinch. I'm suggesting that unchecked power is a threat. The evidence is overwhelming. Racial profiling, excessive force, abuse of authority. It's not just one bad cop. It's a pattern, and it needs to end. Another senator, a progressive ally, leaned forward. Mr. Dawson, what reforms do you believe are necessary? Michael took a breath and delivered the list they had prepared. National standards for use of force. An independent agency to investigate police misconduct. Ending qualified immunity. Mandatory body cameras. A public database of officers with histories of excessive force complaints. And federal penalties for departments that fail to address racial bias. The room erupted in murmurs. Some senators nodded in agreement. Others looked visibly irritated. Callahan leaned back in his chair. You do realize that most police departments won't stand for this, correct? Michael didn't hesitate. Then they'll have to decide whether they want to serve the people, or serve their own interests. It was going to be a fight. But Michael Dawson wasn't backing down. Brian Carter had once walked the halls of his precinct with confidence, commanding respect, feared by those who opposed him. Now, he was just another inmate, stripped of everything he had once held dear. Prison had not been kind to him. The guards treated him with barely concealed contempt. The inmates saw him as a prize, a corrupt cop finally getting what he deserved. Every day was a battle for survival. He kept his back against the walls, never letting his guard down, always aware that danger lurked around every corner. One evening, as he returned to his cell, he found a letter waiting for him. The envelope was plain, but the handwriting was familiar. Michael Dawson. Brian's fingers trembled as he opened it. Officer Carter, it began. I have thought a lot about what happened that night. About the choices you made. About the choices I was forced to make because of you. I want you to know that I don't hate you. Hate is easy. Hate is what allows things like this to keep happening. But I also won't forgive you. Not because I want revenge, but because forgiveness without accountability means nothing. You have lost everything now. Maybe that will give you the clarity you never had before. I hope you understand what you've done. I hope, in time, you realize that your downfall wasn't because of some political agenda or a media witch hunt. It was because you chose the wrong side of history. That is the last thing I will ever say to you. Brian stared at the letter, his hands shaking. For the first time, he let himself feel it. The weight of everything he had done. The guilt, the shame, and the realization that, no matter how much he wanted to blame others, he had brought this upon himself. He crumpled the letter in his fists and let out a strangled, hollow laugh. There was no escape. This was his life now. Michael Dawson stood at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, looking out at the massive crowd that had gathered before him. Protesters, activists, everyday citizens who had taken to the streets to demand change. He stepped up to the microphone. "I stand before you not just as a man who was wronged," he began, "but as a man who refuses to let that wrong define us. This is not just about me. This is about every black man and woman who has ever had to fear the people meant to protect them. This is about justice, about accountability, about a future where our children don't have to grow up wondering if they'll be next." The crowd erupted into cheers. "This fight isn't over," Michael continued. "The system won't change overnight. But we are here, we are loud, and we will not be ignored." He looked over at Aisha, who nodded at him. The work was just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Michael felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The fight for reform had barely begun when the backlash came crashing down like a tidal wave. Michael Dawson had expected resistance. But not at this level. Conservative media outlets painted him as a dangerous radical, accusing him of trying to destroy the police and undermine law and order. Right-wing politicians labeled him as the face of anti-cop hysteria, twisting his words to fit their narrative. Social media was flooded with vitriol, death threats, racial slurs, even calls for his assassination. But the real battle was happening in Congress. Behind closed doors, law enforcement unions were pressuring lawmakers to reject the proposed reforms. Wealthy donors poured money into attack ads against politicians who supported the bill. The Senate hearings on the Police Accountability Act turned into a circus, with conservative senators railing against what they called unnecessary restrictions on officers. Michael sat through it all, his face unreadable as he listened to men like Senator James Callahan twist reality to fit their agenda. "This legislation is nothing more than an attempt to handcuff our brave men and women in uniform," Callahan declared during one hearing. "We need to support our police, not vilify them. What happened to Mr. Dawson was unfortunate. But we cannot let one incident define an entire profession." Michael leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about one incident, Senator," he said. "It's about a pattern, a system, and if you refuse to acknowledge that, then you are part of the problem." The room went silent. Michael knew he had won the moment. But he also knew it wouldn't be enough. He needed more than words. He needed action. That night, he met with Aisha and their closest allies in the movement. "They're stalling," she said, frustration etched into her face. "They know if they delay long enough, the public will move on. We need something big to keep the momentum going." Michael nodded. "Then let's give them something they can't ignore." The next morning, they announced the People's March for Justice, a massive, nationwide protest scheduled to take place in every major city. A march so large, so overwhelming, that lawmakers would have no choice but to listen. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The morning of the march, the streets of Washington, D.C. were flooded with people. Thousands. No, millions. They came from every corner of the country. Young and old, black and white, students, activists, families, even veterans and former police officers who believed in reform. The signs they carried told the story of their movement. Justice delayed is justice denied. No more blood on the pavement. Reform now. Michael stood at the front of the crowd, the weight of history pressing down on him. This was more than just a protest. It was a statement, a declaration, a demand for change. As the march began, the chants echoed through the city streets. No justice, no peace. Say his name, George Floyd. Say her name, Breonna Taylor. They marched past the White House, past Congress, past the Supreme Court. Michael Dawson walked with them, surrounded by thousands, yet feeling the solitude of responsibility. He had become the face of this movement, whether he wanted to or not. Somewhere in the crowd, Aisha walked beside him. "This is it," she said. "This is the moment." Michael nodded, but he knew better than anyone, marches alone wouldn't change the system. Laws would, power would, and the people who held that power were already working against them. The march was peaceful, but elsewhere, things weren't so calm. In several cities, counter-protesters gathered, waving flags, chanting against the movement. Some were armed. Fights broke out. Police responded with force. Tear gas filled the air in some places. Arrests were made. The media twisted the story. Some outlets focused on the unity and strength of the movement. Others painted it as chaos, as a threat to law and order. Michael watched it all unfold. And as night fell, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The halls of Congress were eerily quiet on the day of the vote. The Police Accountability Act had made it through the House. But the Senate was another story. Michael Dawson sat in the gallery, watching as senators took their seats. This was it. The moment that would determine whether everything they had fought for would become law, or whether it would all crumble under political pressure. Senator Callahan was among the first to speak. "This bill is dangerous," he declared. "It will tie the hands of our police, embolden criminals, and make our communities less safe." Michael clenched his fists. He had heard this argument 100 times before. The same fear-mongering tactics. The same refusal to acknowledge the real issue. Then came the voices of those who supported the bill. "We are not anti-police," one senator argued. "We are anti-police brutality. We are anti-racial profiling. We are anti-corruption. And if you stand against this bill, you are standing against justice." The debate raged for hours. Then came the roll call. Michael held his breath as each senator cast their vote. Yes, no, yes, no. The numbers climbed, the tension mounting with every vote. And then, it passed. 51-49. The chamber erupted. Some senators cheered. Others stormed out in fury. Michael let out a slow breath, his heart pounding in his chest. It was done. History had been made. 1 week after the bill's passage, Michael Dawson stood on the steps of the Capitol, addressing the nation. "This is not the end of the fight," he said. "This is only the beginning. Laws alone will not change hearts. Policies alone will not erase generations of injustice. But today, we took a step forward. Today, we showed that change is possible." The crowd erupted into cheers. Aisha stood beside him, smiling. "You did it." Michael shook his head. "We did it." Far away, in a prison cell, Brian Carter watched the speech on a small TV. He looked older now, worn down, stripped of the arrogance he once carried. He had lost everything. And yet, as he listened to Michael's words, a strange feeling settled over him. Regret. For the first time, he truly understood. Michael Dawson had won. Justice had won. And history had changed forever.